Hello.
I'm Lauren.
I am Ken.
And this is Paradise After Dark.
Duck, 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 duck.
Paradise After Dark is an independent podcast covering true crime,
Unsolved mysteries,
missing people,
and every now and then an urban legend.
If you'd like to support the show and get a bunch of extra content, please sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/palmhogmedia. That's PALMAHAWK media.
And be sure to check out our website at paradiseafterdark.com.
On the website, you'll find links to all of our episodes, even the archived episodes, our mailing list, our merch store, which we have some new cool stuff in, links to our social media, and of course our Patreon.
Yeah, we also have a little bit of the virtual tip jar that every now and then you want to swing by the website and help out the show by dropping a little tip. You can do that. And if you do, we'll give you a little shout out on the show.
Yeah, we actually have a shout out for Tip Jar this week. We have two, actually. We have Melissa from Brunswick, Maine. I bet Melissa is
freezing her tail off.
Freezing her tushy off.
Yeah, exactly.
And Patrick from Jacksonville, Florida.
Jacksonville loves us.
Jacksonville does love us.
Jacksonville loves us.
So
thank you, Jacksonville.
Thank you, Melissa and Patrick, for going to paradiseafterdark.com and leaving us a tip in the tip jar.
Now, I do have a shout out that I would like to give. It comes to Colleen, who has been a listener forever. She does engage us every now and then with social media, but nothing makes me smile more than I'm just kind of having one of those days and all of a sudden somebody walks up and the first thing out of their mouth is dark, 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 dark. I don't know. It's made me smile. So thank you, Colleen, because that day I kind of needed that smile and I really appreciate that. So there you go.
That's awesome.
Well, she's not, there's no monetary. You don't necessarily have to support us monetarily, but just listen to the show. You guys are all great. So thank you.
Love us.
Love us.
And one more huge shout out to my new research assistant, my amazing research assistant, Audrey. She did a huge chunk of the research on this case that we're going to do tonight. And as you all know, starting the beginning of the year, we're going weekly, and it's just a huge help to have Audrey. She's amazing. She does amazing research. So thank you, Audrey, and stay tuned for more.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can get when you have multiple people doing research. So,
right, yeah.
Looking here and there, you can kind of put together, you get as much factual information as possible.
Yeah, so we got to give credit where credit is due. So, Audrey, thank you so much for helping us out with this episode. And are you ready to just dive into it, Ken?
Yeah, I do have to say that on this particular episode, Lauren and I we've had a couple different off-mic discussions. It's very frustrating, this case, and I do have to forewarn people. It has to do with a couple young children in this case, and basically a pedophile. And that's one thing it frustrates me, but I think we have to put this case out there. And I'll be honest, there wasn't really a whole lot of information on this particular case.
It was hard to find information on this case, and that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring it to light.
Absolutely. So let's get started. So what are we talking about tonight, Lauren?
We are talking about the case of Staci Lynn Jazvac. So Staci Lynn Jazvac was 11 years old on January 30th, 1986, when she left her Lauderdale Lakes home on a bicycle around 6 p.m. to purchase poster board for a project. The last known sighting of her was by the cashier at the store, who recalled having sold her the poster board between 6:30 and 7 p.m. When Staci failed to return by dusk, her mother, Nancy, began to search for her, obviously. At about 7:30 p.m., her mother encountered a Broward County Sheriff's deputy who had Staci's bicycle in the trunk of his car.
I can only imagine what went through her mind.
The deputy had found the bicycle abandoned in a vacant field along State Road 7 across from Lakes Mall, only 3 blocks from her house.
So not very far away. She was probably en route home.
Right. So let's talk about Staci first. Staci was born October 9th, 1974, to Dennis and Nancy Jazvac. Now, Dennis Jazvac, her father, was in the Army, and her parents had divorced when Staci was just 2 years old. Dennis Jazvac spent most of Staci's life deployed to South Korea and Western Germany. So he wasn't really in her life that much. She was in 6th grade at Lauderdale Lakes Middle School, And she was a joyful child, even on her last day of life. She loved to run. She had just learned that she had made the Lauderdale Lakes Middle School track team. But when she came home from tryouts after 5 p.m., there was little time for celebration. Now, this is the day she disappeared. She made the track team, but as a straight A student, she had homework to do, and she needed some poster board for a reading project. She asked her mother, Nancy, if she could run to the store just a few blocks away, and Nancy agreed. Before Staci left, Nancy actually taped a flashlight to her 10-speed bicycle because it was going to get dark soon. Mm-hmm. So as mentioned, at roughly 6 p.m., she set off with $3 in her pocket. After taking a shortcut through a field, Staci arrived at the Super X drugstore near the corner of State Road 7 and Oakland Park Boulevard. She paid for the poster board and headed toward home.
Now, a witness named Ricky Mudd later told police that sometime around 6:30 he had witnessed a red pickup truck leaving the field through which Staci had ridden. Now, the truck left a cloud of dust as it sped away, and he also noticed the red glint of a reflector about 100 feet from the road. So he looks over, he sees this reflector.
Like the kind of reflector that might be on a bicycle?
Exactly, so that's what he found. So Mudd goes over to investigate and found a 10-speed bicycle on the ground with a still shining flashlight fastened with duct tape to the handlebars. This is the flashlight that her mother had attached to the handlebars for.
So Staci was 4 feet 4 inches tall, 60 pounds with shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair parted down the middle. She was last seen wearing jeans and a new pink shirt with a unicorn with Staci's name embroidered on it. An intensive search by Broward Sheriff's deputies, family, and hundreds of volunteers, and even psychics, had failed to turn up any clues. This case is classified as a missing juvenile, but all indications point to the possibility of abduction, Broward Sheriff's Office Detective Jeff Jazvac told the Miami Herald. We've ruled out the possibility that she ran away. Somebody had to have grabbed her because she wouldn't go with a stranger willingly, Nancy Jazvac told the paper 2 days after Staci vanished. What anybody would want with an 11-year-old child is beyond me. Dennis Jazvac, who we had mentioned was divorced from Nancy, flew in from Fort Ord, California, where he was stationed as a soldier to assist with the effort to find his daughter. The Friday after Staci went missing, deputies stopped all red trucks, but Detective Jazvac said the effort proved futile. Searches with helicopters and dogs didn't turn up anything either. We've searched every vacant house and dumpster in the area, Jazvac said. We've gone house to house and door to door. Divers searched a canal immediately behind the Jazvac home, but came up with nothing. By day 3, they still had nothing. Thousands of flyers that were donated by a local printing company were passed out all over Broward County. We're just waiting now for input from the community, Jazvac said. So far, we have nothing concrete. A psychic called the family and told them that Staci was within a mile from the house. Staci's name and description was filed with the National Center for Missing Children and the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center. On day 4, another psychic called and told the family that Staci was alive and her kidnapper had released her in an area filled with rubble. Family and friends began searching construction sites. I can't recall a psychic's tip ever being real productive, but we're not going to discount anything. Jim Legidal, Broward Sheriff's spokesman, told the Miami Herald. The following week, the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center announced a $5,000 reward for anyone who could bring in information leading to Staci. I'm begging people now, get involved, John Walsh said. She's not just another missing kid, she's a little girl that needs our help. On February 12th, the Lauderdale Lakes City Council offered another $5,000 to the reward, and the Broward County Sheriff's Office offered $1,000, bringing the reward up to $11,000.
And sadly, Staci's body was found in a field on February 14th, 1986. This is shortly after noon by a workman who had driven to the southwest corner of Coral Springs to eat his lunch. This was about 10 miles away from where she had actually disappeared from. So this was about 10 miles away from where the man witnessed the truck pulling away. Now, Broward Sheriff Nick Navarro said it appeared no effort had been made to hide the body. So this is basically a dump. And sheriff's investigators had been on the scene for about 4 hours when Navarro, accompanied by the Broward County Medical Examiner, Dr. Ronald K. Wright, announced that the body had positively been identified as Staci. Now, Wright said the preliminary identification had been made using Staci's dental records. He said the girl had been dead at least 24 hours when she was found. Now, Staci's date of death is listed as February 14th of 1986. Now, this is the date that her body was found, although some sources list it as January 30th, which was the date she went missing. And Staci's cause of death is listed as asphyxiation.
All right, let's take a quick break before we continue on with this. Okay, and we're back. Now, as we just said, Staci's cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. A man named Michael Thomas Rivera was arrested on February 13th of 1986. This was the day before Staci's body was found. Now, he was arrested for the kidnapping and attempted murder of a different 11-year-old girl in Coral Springs, Florida. At the time of his arrest, he was 23. Police first connected Michael Rivera to Staci's murder through a complaint filed by a woman named Star Peck, a Pompano Beach resident. She testified that she received approximately 30 telephone calls during September of 1985 from a man who identified himself as Tony. He would discuss his sexual fantasies and describe the women's clothing that he wore, such as pantyhose and a one-piece bodysuit. She received the last telephone call from Tony after Staci's murder. Miss Peck testified that he had said he had done something very terrible. I'm sure you've heard about the girl Staci. I killed her, and I didn't mean to. I had a notion to go out and expose myself. I saw this girl getting off her bike, and I went up behind her. She testified that he admitted putting an ether rag over Staci's mouth and dragging her into the back of a van where he sexually assaulted her. Rivera had been employed by Star Peck, and she identified him as Tony. So Michael Rivera had been previously employed by this woman, and then he started making all these phone calls to her and basically admitted to her that he killed Staci. Mm-hmm. On February 13th, detectives Richard Sheff and Philip Amabile of the Broward County Sheriff's Department took Rivera into custody on the unrelated outstanding warrants and transported him to headquarters where they told him that they wanted to speak with him. Detective Sheff testified that Rivera responded, "If I talk to you guys, I'll spend the next 20 years in jail." After reading him his Miranda rights, Detective Sheff told Rivera that someone had advised them that Rivera had information about the disappearance of Staci Jazvac. The detective testified that Rivera admitted making the obscene phone calls to Star Peck, but denied having anything to do with the disappearance of Staci. But he did admit to the attack on an 11-year-old girl, whose first name is Jennifer, in Coral Springs in July of 1985. Now, this was actually the original crime that he was arrested for on February 13th of 1986.
Yeah. Which was like the day before she was found.
It was the day before Staci's body was found.
Correct.
He was arrested for this different attack on a different 11-year-old.
Yeah, so let's get into that for just a quick second, because obviously this is compiled with everything else. On July 10th of 1985, Michael Rivera kidnaps this 11-year-old Jennifer as she was on her way to the day camp bus stop where Rivera grabbed her. Now, at her trial, Jennifer actually gave a statement, and according to her testimony, Rivera picked her up from behind, strangling her, and carried her behind a nearby gazebo, laying her on her stomach. Rivera threatened to kill her when she started fighting against him. So she's putting up a fight. She's not just taking this from him. Now, Jennifer stated that as she began flailing and fighting, she started falling unconscious, and Rivera rolled her onto her back and placed a beach bag over her face. Now, luckily, thank God, Jennifer was discovered by a witness. Someone saw all this transpiring, and his name was Tony Leonardo. And Tony, who had seen Rivera running away and went to investigate what was going on. So he sees Rivera running away. He's trying to figure out what's he running from, so he goes over to check it out. And Leonardo said that he removed the beach bag from Jennifer's face and had to shake her to receive a response. So she's almost unconscious enough to where he can't communicate. He's got to like shake her up and be like, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? Now, a doctor later determined that if she had been strangled any longer, that she would have died. So she was that close to being dead. Now, several people in the area reported receiving phone calls from this Tony guy who stated that he had molested a little girl and asked him to call an ambulance. So like, hey, I molested this little girl. Can you call an ambulance?
Was it on the same day that he attacked Jennifer?
Well, I'm not sure if it was on the same day or the next day, but he had claimed it had to have been the same day. If he's calling for an ambulance, he's saying, hey, I've molested this girl. I know where she's at. Somebody call an ambulance. And I think it's just he wanted to kind of put it out there, like he wanted to brag to somebody about what he had done. He's so proud of himself, apparently. So the police questioned Rivera in a later incident. Now, this incident occurred November 4th in 1985, but it involved Rivera exposing himself to children and then chasing them. So he's showing off and then he's chasing after these kids. Now, during the police questioning, Rivera denied committing the attack against Jennifer. However, during a later interview about the Staci Lynn Jazvac case, Rivera admitted to the attack against the 11-year-old Jennifer. Now, Rivera stated that he had seen her and decided to expose himself to her, but instead, he grabbed Jennifer and began to strangle her. And Rivera admitted to putting the girl in the bushes and covering her face with a bag, but he was not sure what he was going to do next and that he was scared away by the walking witness nearby, which is what we talked about. There was a witness that walked by and saw it all transpire, and then he got scared.
Leonardo, right?
Exactly, and he took off running. Keep in mind that he had brutally murdered Staci between the time of his crime against Jennifer and his actual arrest. Now, keep in mind, he gets arrested for the crime against Jennifer the day before they find Staci.
So you have to wonder if there was any other victims in between there.
Exactly, because in that case, for the crime against Jennifer, Rivera was charged with kidnapping, attempted first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated battery, and he was convicted of all these crimes. And he did get sentenced to life in prison and a 25-year sentence for the kidnapping.
Okay, so remind me, because I want to circle back to this after we continue with the case, because I want to talk about his criminal history and what might have made things a little bit different. But we'll circle back to that.
We'll do that, but let me first tell you who this Michael Rivera is. Okay. Michael Rivera is a white male who was born in Bronx, New York on June 25th of 1962. Now, his parents he describes as really restrictive and very overprotective, so they were kind of on him all the time. Now, his father, a Puerto Rican immigrant, owned a gas station, and his mother raised the 4 children in an apartment in Westchester County, New York. Now, Rivera, the second-born son, went to Catholic schools, but he was kind of often absent because of illness, so I guess he was a sickly child. He was close to his mother, but alienated from his dad, who was emotionally distant and drank heavily. Rivera once told a psychologist that his father was God and mother was Jesus. You had to go through mom to get to dad. Rivera says this distance led him, at the age of 9, secretly to look through his father's bedroom dresser where he found a book of pornographic stories. So it begins. Now, Rivera took the book and while reading it, masturbated for the first time. Now, keep in mind, he's a very young man at this point. Now, soon he was doing it several times a day, and now he considers it his first addiction. It was like a drug, Rivera said. Now, when Rivera was 13 years old, the family moves to Florida. And unbeknownst to my parents, it was a drug-infested area, he says. Within 3 months of living in Florida, I smoked my first joint and I was drinking. It wasn't long before he gets away from this smoking and drinking and decides he wants to try LSD. He starts sniffing glue. So he's going into some other things here. So it's kind of progressively getting worse. Now, at the time of his arrest for Staci's murder, he had many prior arrests, as we mentioned earlier, for attempted burglary, lewd and lascivious acts, indecent exposure, and most of these were sex offenses against children. And he's just an awful human being. So somehow his pornographic addiction turns into crimes against children.
And again, I'm going to circle back to this because I really want to talk about his prior offenses.
Yeah, because you can, because he was previously sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1982 in a Brevard Correctional Institute, he became self-described as, quote, butch queen, dressing effeminately and allowing at least 2 men to have sex with him. Now, Rivera says he doesn't consider himself gay. Quote, I don't think I ever was, he says. I'm not physically attracted to men. I attribute it to some type of emotional attachment I was looking for. Loneliness that I was experiencing. This guy's just delusional at this point. I mean, he's basically making excuses for all of his actions.
Right.
Now, he says a sex offender program he attended while in prison backfired terribly. In the meetings, Rivera heard stories from men who attacked and raped women and children. Admittedly, weak-hearted and weak-minded, he soon began fantasizing about violence and rape. He nevertheless informed a defense attorney that he was cured. Hey, I'm much better now. I had all kinds of feelings bottled up, and the way I relieve myself is by exposure for a temporary good feeling. He writes from jail on New Year's Day in 1983. I tried making these women feel as bad as I do. I have corrected that part of me. He has been described as having soft brown eyes, a good humor, a gentle demeanor, and many claim that it can kind of be disarming. So this guy's a very nice... Manipulative guy. Thank you. That's a great term. But any illusion that Rivera really doesn't belong behind bars disappears when he describes his life before prison. In an interview from 2001 by Bob Norman for the New Times Broward Palm Beach, he describes his life before prison. He speaks of his addiction to crack cocaine, of exposing himself to strangers, and his insatiable lust for little children, especially girls. Now, his candor can be chilling, as when he calmly demonstrates the chokehold he used on unsuspecting victims as he intended to rape. So, he's just a sick individual.
So now, thank you for describing exactly what kind of
sick individual this
person is.
Yeah.
The following afternoon, after he's arrested, on February 14th, deputies questioned Rivera again about Staci's disappearance. Sergeant Carney entered the interrogation room and told Rivera that the Broward County Sheriff's Office had the technology to find fingerprints on a body. It was a ploy to draw a reaction, and the detective got one. Rivera became noticeably nervous, Carney later testified, and said, I bet you guys do have fingerprints. During the trial, the Broward County Sheriff's Office detectives told jurors that at one point Rivera told them he blacked out and didn't remember killing Staci. But he did acknowledge telling deputies he might have blacked out that Thursday night while on crack, but denied saying he didn't remember killing Staci. The jury also heard testimony from several of Rivera's fellow inmates. Frank Zuccarello testified that Rivera admitted that he had choked another child in the same way that he had choked Staci. That's, I'm assuming, is Jennifer. Mm-hmm. That Rivera said he had tried to kill that other child but was frightened away by a passerby. And that Rivera said he had taken Staci to the field where she screamed and resisted, and he choked her to death after things got out of hand. He also admitted that he told Star Peck, who we mentioned earlier, who he was making the phone calls to, that he murdered Staci, saying that he confided in her and that was his biggest mistake. William Moyer testified that Rivera stated to him, you know, Bill, I didn't do it, but Tony did it. He later overheard Rivera call Star Peck and identify himself as Tony. Peter Salerno testified that Rivera told him, I didn't mean to kill the little Staci girl. I just wanted to look at her and play with her. A manager of a plantation restaurant testified that he had received over 200 telephone calls during a 2-year period from an anonymous male caller. We're assuming this is Tony. On February 7th, the Friday before Staci's body was discovered, the caller identified himself as Tony and said that he had that Staci girl while wearing pantyhose and that he had put an ether rag over her face.
This is one sick individual.
Let's take a quick break before we finish. Okay, and we're back. So Thursday, April 16th of 1987, 14 months after Staci Jazvac was abducted and killed, a Broward Circuit Court jury, 8 women and 4 men, reached a dramatically swift conclusion. In only 90 minutes, they found Michael Thomas Rivera guilty of first-degree murder. In the first bench directly behind Rivera, the family of 11-year-old Staci sat next to John Walsh, who we all know from America's Most Wanted, but at this point he was just John Walsh of the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center. Staci's mother, Nancy, wept as she hugged family members and friends and John Walsh, whose son Adam was murdered 6 years earlier and who inspired the Child Advocacy Center bearing his name, raised his fist triumphantly.
Well, he had to be happy, because he's there supporting these families, and this is a win.
Well, we covered the Adam Walsh case. It was a two-parter we did.
Episode 50.
Yes, you're right. It was episode 50. And yes, John Walsh he has done so much over the years to help missing, exploited children, murdered children, America's Most Wanted. Now he's got The Hunt with his son, Callahan Walsh. I mean, he's just been such a great person, such a great advocate for victims over the years. Anyway, moving on. Rivera covered his eyes with his hands when the verdict was announced and resisted when bailiffs moved immediately to handcuff him. "Let me be for a second," he shouted. The bailiff struggled briefly to lock the handcuffs while Circuit Judge John G. Ferris tried to calm the sobbing defendant. "Mr. Rivera, if you'll just relax, everything will be all right." Rivera continued to plead his innocence as jail guards led him from the courtroom. "I can't bring Staci back," Nancy, her mother, said moments later outside the courtroom. "But I also know another little girl won't die." Dennis Jazvac, Staci's father, said he never doubted that Rivera murdered his daughter. "I believe justice was done, and I believe in this case the right man was convicted."
So that brings us to his sentencing. So Rivera was sentenced to death on May 1st of 1987. Now, over the years from 1991 to most recently, which is 2015, many motions and attempts for a rehearing were filed. And in the 2015 appeal, Rivera's attorneys pointed in part to newly discovered DNA evidence. That evidence involved a hair which was found in a van that prosecutors said had been used by Rivera to abduct Staci. The hair was found to not belong to the victim, which Rivera argued could bolster his contention that he did not murder the girl. But the Supreme Court rejected this argument, stating the DNA evidence simply confirms the possibility that was asserted during the trial that the hair does not actually belong to Staci. Notably, the evidence is not exculpatory in nature, nor does it establish that Staci was never in contact with Rivera or in the van. Moreover, the state presented ample evidence during trial that Rivera committed the murder, including the testimony of 2 non-jailhouse witnesses to whom Rivera confessed. So this had to have been the phone call to Peck, I'm assuming.
Star Peck.
Yeah. So the phone call to her, and then obviously other witnesses. But there's a lot more involved in this guy. So the people around him obviously knew this guy was just a sicko.
Right. So what I was talking about earlier, what I wanted to kind of get into, is that this very, very unfortunately, this crime occurred in 1986. So Michael Rivera had a very extensive criminal record, including in October of 1980, he was charged with sexual offense against a child. And again, in 1981, he was charged with indecent disclosure and lewd and lascivious acts with a child under 16. I mean, he had in 1985, lewd and lascivious he just had
a laundry list of stuff.
A laundry list of this behavior. Now, I just want to take one charge in particular. On October 10th of 1980, that was the date of the offense, and he was sentenced to 5 years of probation for sexual offense against a child. This was back in 1981.
Sexual offense on a child resulted in probation?
Probation, yes. So what I want to kind of talk about is the difference between then and now. because now the penalty for lewd and lascivious molestation of a child is determined whether the offender was an adult or a minor, and also whether the child victim was under 12. In this case, we do not know how old the child was. All we can see here in the Florida capital cases.state.florida.us, we're looking at his criminal history. All it says is sexual offense against a child. But then in November of 1981, we have lewd and lascivious acts with a child under 16.
So we can assume that it might have been under 12 years old.
Could have been under 12 years old.
Because it wasn't noted less than 16.
I'm not sure. But what I want to explain to you about the law now. The crime of lewd and lascivious molestation by a person 18 or older on a child under 12 is a life felony punishable by a minimum of 25 years in prison, followed by lifetime sex offender probation and a $10,000 fine. So if that charge, sexual offense against a child, was happening today and that child was under 12, it would be a minimum of 25 years in prison and then lifetime sex offender probation. Now, the other charge that he had in 1981, lewd and lascivious molestation by an adult on a child 12 or older but under 16. That is a second-degree felony, punishable by up to 15 years in prison, 15 years of sex offender probation, and a $10,000 fine. So my point that I'm trying to make here is I'm looking at Florida law. Now, Florida law is obviously my wheelhouse. That's what I know. And back in the 80s, if only they had been as strict as they are now. Back in 81 or 1980, if he had been sentenced to 25 years or even 15 years, then the 11-year-old Jennifer never would have been attacked and kidnapped. And 11-year-old Staci Lynn Jazvac never would have been kidnapped and assaulted and murdered. So it's just really unfortunate that back then the laws were not so relaxed, just much more relaxed than they are now. And I'm really proud of our justice system for really cracking down on not even just molestation cases, any kinds of case.
Well, one thing that I want to hit on here, and I don't want to interrupt what you're saying, is you're absolutely right, because a lot of times we always criticize the justice system for not doing something, but at least here we're seeing a progression. Obviously, if those factors were put into play back then, yes, you're absolutely right. Jennifer never would have been attacked. Staci never would have been murdered. But the one thing that in looking into this case that blows my mind, and I looked to see if there was any other...
Can I say something before you get into something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to touch on real quick that the 3 strikes law was enacted in July of 1999. It applies to defendants with 2 prior convictions who are convicted of a violent felony for the 3rd time. So basically 3 violent felonies, which Michael Rivera had, 3 violent felonies, and he would have been sentenced to life in prison. 3 strikes and it's life in prison. And I could read you the entire statute and law, but basically 3 strikes. Now that didn't go into effect until 1999. That's almost 20 years after his first conviction in 1980 for sexual offense against a child. So it's just...
Well, there's a laundry list of stuff.
It just really bothers me that the laws were so lax at that time. And if they had cracked down the way they crack down now, that not just in this case, but in so many cases where these sex offenders, these perverts, these sickos had prior convictions, they should have just been in prison. And so many girls or boys or children or women or men would have been saved from rape or murder or abduction or kidnapping or torture.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%. I understand. And like I said, it's
just a frustrating thing. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. One thing that frustrates me is, well, first of all, like Lauren is saying, it's not just the sexual acts. This guy's got a laundry list of stuff. There's drug charges. There's dealing in stolen property. There's burglary. There was He didn't, I don't even think he had a license. He constantly license was suspended. I mean, there's these little bitty factors. So it's kind of like these little bitty charges that were there. The one thing that gets me is these are two cases that we can find information on. And this is what I was trying to progress to a little earlier. What else is there? Now, I did look to see if I could find other cases where a child was missing in this area, because it seems like he didn't venture out from his home county too far. But I was trying to find, there are some missing children in that area. One was a little boy, and there were two other girls, one of which has never been found. But it's one of those things where it's like, did this guy have anything to do with it? The era wasn't.
He very well could have.
Exactly. So, I mean, we know of these two. Is there more that's there? And that's the part that scares me the most, is when you have a sick bastard like this, you know, I can't imagine that, you know, the first time Jennifer, he got her, but was that his first? That's just the first one we know about.
Right.
And then the second, well, there's actually others that Lauren spoke about earlier that were previous to that. This is the first time where he really enacted this rage where he was going to, admittedly, in some of the cases, was going to kill Jennifer. He put a bag over her. He was strangling her. He was going to kill her.
But he was interrupted.
Exactly, got interrupted, which we hear a lot in some of these killers. But I'm just so curious if there was other murders. And I'm very happy that they at least nailed this guy. They got him behind bars, and he can just sit there and rot until he dies, because that's where he belongs. If this is the type of person that's going to be out in the communities that we live in and around children or families or near schools or whatever, I'm glad this guy is exactly where he should be.
Well, as you just said, Michael Rivera, he's now 59 years old, and to this date remains on death row at Union Correctional Institute in Rayford, Florida.
Good. Rayford is not a nice prison, folks.
No. So he's still on death row. I don't know what the holdup is. I guess his last appeal to the Supreme Court was in 2015, and that didn't go as planned, so I don't know when his execution will be, but
well, hopefully it drags it out a little bit. You know, the fact
I don't know what's worse, being executed or having to be on death row for 86, 96, over 30 years, 35, 36 years.
Yeah, it's hard. The one thing about death row that I really think is a good tool, death row is really just sort of a mind mess up. So these guys that are this sick, you're sent to death row, and you sit there and you can't really do anything. You're very limited as to what you can do. So instead of lifers get a whole different set of rules versus someone that's on death row. You're very limited to.
I believe in deth row they only get 1 hour a day
exactly.
outside.
So you're very contained. You're
one
very
shower
limited.
a week.
So it's very harsh. So it's a much more harsh punishment than just getting life. Obviously, the ultimate thing is death if they're actually, you know, if everything goes forward with a death sentence. But in this case, if he remains on death row until he dies, I think that's going to be a much more harsh punishment for this sick bastard.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I guess we'll just have to keep tabs on him and see if a execution date is scheduled.
Yep. Well, I can assure you I will not lose any sleep worrying about Michael Rivera.
Yes. Neither will I.
All right, everyone. So that's going to be it for tonight. And like we said earlier, please be sure to check out our website, paradiseafterdark.com, for links to all of our social media, our Patreon, merch store. All that good stuff is on our website. You can find out a little bit more about us. And everyone, thank you so very much for listening
To Paradise After Dark.
Dark, 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 dark.